Good evening and welcome to The Absolute Truth with Emerald Robinson. I'm Eduardo Neret in for Emerald. The giant exercise in gaslighting the American people at the DNC continued last night. Thank God the event's almost over. The highlight, if you can even call it that, of last night's event was the Democrat Party's vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz. Walz has become the star of what is in effect a Democrat minstrel show, intended to parade around their ideal version of a modern 21st century white man. And he has all the cringe to go along with it. The media tells us Tim Walz is folksy. He's just a regular guy. But really, how many regular guys do you know that believe it's okay to chemically and physically castrate young children in the name of providing them health care? Tim Walz made his state, Minnesota, a sanctuary state for children to get this so-called gender-affirming care. Totally normal, totally regular, right? And when he was a teacher, Tim Walz also created a gay-straight alliance club. So honestly, does anyone think that it's normal for a grown man who's supposed to be educating students to be talking to them about their sexuality? No, obviously not. It's actually really creepy. So if there's a guy who looks like Tim Walz around your kid's school and is talking to them about their sexuality, you should call the police. That's not a regular guy. Regular guys don't talk to school children about their sexuality. Now, later on in his speech, Walz claimed that he and his wife had in vitro fertilization, IVF. The Republicans are trying to take away IVF. He claimed without that, he wouldn't have been able to have children. But what's interesting is the Associated Press has proven Walz's claims to be untrue. Donald Trump's running mate, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, made that point.
Governor Tim Walz is getting heat for previously saying that him and his wife used IVF to start their family when he actually used IUI. You know, you have attacked him for not being clear about his military record. Do you think this is becoming a pattern, him using ambiguous language, either through commission or omission, when talking about his record?
Yeah, I do that. I mean, look, I saw that this morning, and it's just such a bizarre thing to lie about, right?
It is. It's so weird. Who lies about that? Who goes around saying, oh, my wife and I needed IVF to have children when it's completely and totally false? Who does that? Why would it be necessary to lie about such a thing? What kind of a creep feels the need to lie about how they conceive their children? It is, as J.D. Vance said, completely bizarre. And of course, the biggest lie of all is about Tim Walz's own life and career. He has gone around saying that he was a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, when the reality is he served in the U.S. Army National Guard. And while it is true that he served in the National Guard, it is totally false that he was ever in a war zone. He was sent overseas to Italy, not exactly a place where you're going to see combat. And again, why would anyone need to lie about this? It's actually a mark of service, a good thing that anyone would spend 20 years serving in the Army National Guard. It's something to be proud of. So why can't Tim Walz just say that? Why can't he just tell the truth and say, I served in the National Guard? Why does he have to fabricate things? It's like he's overcompensating for some sense of insecurity. Now, despite all the praise for Kamala Harris this week, one thing we have heard very little about is her views on foreign policy, likely because under Joe Biden, the world has literally been on fire, and Kamala Harris has sat through all of that. As for her relative inexperience at handling foreign policy, what is it? What are her views? She hasn't shared any of those views. And yet this is the woman that they want us to believe is ready to become commander-in-chief. A senior Democrat official says, actually, though, the American people shouldn't fret. Kamala Harris is perfectly ready for the job. According to this official, quote, I sat in the Situation Room for hundreds of meetings with President Obama and the vice president. And the vice president was included in almost every major foreign policy decision. Joe Biden has done the same thing with Kamala Harris. Okay, so would that include the debacle in Afghanistan? Would that include the war in Ukraine? Would that include the war in the Middle East? We know for a fact that just weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, Joe Biden sent Kamala Harris to the Munich Security Conference. And she essentially said that Ukraine was going to be a part of NATO. So that is her foreign policy chops for you. Someone who goes to Europe, and 2 weeks later, Russia is invading Ukraine. We know who we can blame for all of this if Kamala was in the room. Kamala Harris was also there at every turn to ensure maximum humiliation for the United States during the Afghanistan crisis. As for how the U.S. under President Harris would interact with China, that's another example. A recent article in the South China Morning Post seems to think that a Kamala Harris-Tim Walz presidency would be great for China. So not only is Kamala Harris allowing our enemies to invade and start wars around the world, but are actually our most serious geopolitical security foe, China, they seem to think that a Kamala Harris presidency would be great for them. So a recent headline, compared Kamala Harris's China policy to that of Richard Nixon, the man who opened up China to the world. But in reality, Kamala Harris is no Richard Nixon. She's a Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, of course, infamously unilaterally disarmed the United States in the growing threat of the Soviet Union in his time. So similarly, Kamala Harris has done the same thing. As head of the White House Space Council in 2022, she talked about disarming the United States' strategic high ground in space.
We have consistently condemned these tests and called them reckless. But that is not enough. Today we are going further. I am pleased to announce that as of today, the United States commits not to conduct destructive, direct ascent, anti-satellite missile testing.
So there you go. She's broadcasting to our enemies around the world. We are not going to test anti-missile, anti-satellite. We are not going to do these tests to learn how to protect the United States. You don't have to worry about our capabilities because we are not even attempting to learn how to defend ourselves. So to recap, Kamala Harris is pro-China. She wants to play footsie with the mullahs of Iran. And she was one of the principal architects of the botched Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021. And again, she was in Europe 2 weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. She has also unilaterally disarmed the United States in space, as you just saw there. So under Kamala Harris, our rivals will gain ground. Our rivals will continue to do what they have done under Joe Biden. Joining us now to react is Brandon Weichert. He's a national security analyst over at the National Interest, as well as the author of several books, including most recently, The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy. Brandon, thanks so much for coming on. You know, it's interesting to me because one of the things that Democrats used to do, especially during the age of Obama and in his rise, they used to talk about foreign policy. They used to point at, for example, George W. Bush's foreign policy and used to use that as a contrast. And when you think of it, there is some understanding as to why foreign policy isn't at the forefront of most Americans' minds. They're concerned with domestic issues. But under Bush, for example, things were so bad, or the perception was things were so bad that they wanted to talk about foreign policy. And yet now, it's pretty telling why they're not talking about it.
It is, and thank you for having me. And I think that this is also just indicative of the sort of Kamala Harris, Tim Walz overarching campaign strategy of not talking about anything in particular, making it all about, you know, the vibes, as the kids would say these days. There's absolutely no substance to what they're talking about. And when they do talk about substance, as we saw in those clips you just showed, Kamala Harris is a one-woman wrecking crew of U.S. national security and foreign policy. And if she does win the election, she is going to make the Carter years, the Biden years, the Obama years look like cakewalks, because she will unilaterally disarm us in the face of all rivals.
Well, I think something that should concern Republicans is the fact that as bad as things are internationally, it may not even have an effect on this upcoming election. I mean, all the polls consistently show that the top issues to voters are immigration, crime, the economy, inflation. And so in some sense, we could have World War III erupt tomorrow. And I almost wonder if the average voter out there would even care because of how bad things are at home. I mean, we have never been closer to nuclear war, and yet that's almost not even a political factor this election.
Exactly. Well, and it's important to note that from a sort of constitutional government standpoint, the president's biggest role and biggest impact is in the area of foreign policy. This is why presidents traditionally love to get involved in foreign policy. Even Trump, who did not campaign as a foreign policy president, a lot of his legacy was that of a foreign policy leader, because he learned he has a lot more maneuvering room in the arena of foreign policy as president than he does in other policy domains. And so Kamala Harris, even though she's not talking about it, is going to find that she has a lot of power in foreign policy, that she can make a lot of headlines for herself in that arena. And of course, that's where a lot of damage can be done to our security, to the way we secure ourselves. As you saw with the space issue, people don't think about space either, but our entire society runs off of satellites. And if those satellites are destroyed, it's pretty much game over for the United States as a modern, sophisticated country, at least for a period of time. And so that's exactly why we should be talking about this. And also, lastly, I'll just say that in terms of foreign policy, immigration and some of these other issues with the economy, they are directly tied to our foreign policy and military defense. We spend a lot of money that we don't have on national security issues. And we also, with an open border, the more instability that reigns around the world, thanks to Biden and Harris, the more likely there is that illegal immigrants and refugees are going to be flowing across our borders.
That's so true. That's so true. And most Americans probably haven't made the connection of, for example, the war between Russia and Ukraine and how that has realigned traditional alliances, that has hurt our relationships with countries that traditionally would be open to selling us oil, selling in U.S. dollars, and now they are openly selling in other currencies, which, if you have the end of the petrodollar, that isn't just an economic concern for us, as you pointed out, it's a national security one. So do you think Republicans are making those connections enough to say, hey, here's what's happening on the world stage and how it is actually affecting domestic issues that you care about? And if not, as someone who does write about foreign policy and national security, what would your advice be to, a Trump campaign or really any elected Republican seeking office on how they can make this issue relatable to voters at home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I have sort of sent, missives over to the, the Trump people over at Mar-a-Lago that I have some communication with. I think the biggest issue, and you just sort of pointed to it, is this issue of the rise of the BRICS alliance led by China and Russia, which is really a geo-economic alliance aimed at neutering the dollar's dominance, the U.S. dollar's dominance, destroying that, and you basically destroy the U.S. empire, if you will, the ability for us to fund all of these campaigns abroad, and so as well as our economics, security at home, and so that should be the number one issue in terms of foreign and economic policy the Trump campaign talks about. And I think there's a lot of millennials and Gen Z type voters, especially those involved with sort of cryptocurrency and whatnot, who would be very galvanized by the Trump campaign and the overall GOP talking more about what China and Russia are doing to destroy the dollar's dominance. And we don't talk about that enough. And frankly, that is the biggest issue of our time. It's going to be the thing that destroys the United States. We've made the debt so big that and we've spent the dollar the way we have, that it's devalued the currency. And then we've also sanctioned so many countries, gone after Russia's sovereign wealth fund, that now these powerful nations elsewhere are saying we don't want to be reliant on the dollar because we can't trust the Americans to either spend their money wisely or that they won't use the power they have to go after us. And so now we're seeing a real shift in the global power structure, and it's not helpful to the United States.
Something that concerns me, I think, is the way that the U.S. foreign policy structure is set up, and it's tied, obviously, to the 4 years that a president has in office, and I think that's problematic. The Chinese don't think in 4-year increments. They think in 10, 25, 30, 40, 50-year increments. And the United States, I think if you look back at the Cold War, of course, Democrats and Republicans had differing views on how to handle the Soviet Union. But generally speaking, among the mainstream, the idea was that the Soviet Union was a threat. Now, it's not so much. I mean, you basically have Republicans who think China is a threat and the Democrats who embrace them and embrace Chinese opportunity to interfere in our country, steal intellectual property, weaken our companies, etc. Same thing when you look at the Middle East. Republicans see Iran as a threat. They see Saudi Arabia as someone who could be an ally. And the Democrats see the exact opposite. So, is there a way, obviously we are going to continue to have elections every 4 years, but how does a potential Trump administration deal with that concern? I mean, how do they make sure that whatever policies, relationships, deals they set up can't just be undone by the next Democrat that comes into power?
That is an excellent question. And ultimately, it comes down to personnel being policy. One of the things Obama did before he left was he took, I think it was like 100 or so of his political appointees, and he, at the last minute, made them civil servants so they could never be fired. And they joined as senior leaders of the Senior Executive Service, SES. And that was one of the reasons why the Trump administration was dogged with all the leaks and all of the undermining behind the scenes, because they were having to employ Obama holdovers. So the Trump administration, if they're lucky enough to get another term, needs to come in with a comprehensive personnel plan where basically they're not just going to appoint every position they can with loyalists, but they need to also have a plan for when the Trump administration ends, they can convert a lot of those foreign policy political appointees into permanent members of the bureaucracy so that their legacy will be carried on the way that the Democrats have done that for 50 years now. Unfortunately, though, until that can happen, we're going to continue to have this sort of unstable, chaotic foreign policy apparatus.
Yeah, well, look, that gives me a little bit of hope. I mean, I didn't think there was necessarily a solution to that, but, it is hopeful for the next Republican that gets in there. Brandon Weichert, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so we told you Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is making a big announcement tomorrow. The question is he actually going to endorse Donald Trump? We explore that question straight ahead. Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is reportedly about to drop out of the race. As we told you yesterday, he is reportedly also going to endorse Donald Trump with that announcement. This could obviously be a huge shakeup in the 2024 race. Investigative journalist Mark Groubert will be at RFK's press conference tomorrow in Phoenix to see what he has to say, and hopefully he'll share a little bit what's on the inside. He wrote this on Twitter, quote, "I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will take the stage at 2 p.m., doors open at 9, and do his thing on how he is bailing out and will help Trump. Trump's audience, meanwhile, close by. The doors will already be open in that event. And then he'll come back and do the arm-raising thing with Trump somewhere into Trump's speech around 5 p.m. local time. Just my reading media tea leaves." And if that wasn't on the nose enough, there's this image that's been floating around the last few days, which sounds like the Trump campaign is teeing up Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to bow out of the race. So there are rumors coming from all sides of this equation. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s running mate said this in a recent interview as well.
We are willing to work with anyone who is sincere in their endeavor to fix and address this issue.
Do you believe the Trump campaign and Trump himself is sincere? Do you see a home? You talk about this as being Bobby's decision. Do you see a home for RFK Jr. in the Trump administration, Health and Human Services, something to that extent?
I would fully support it. I would fully support a strong partnership dedicated to this issue.
Now take a look at this poll by NBC News. It just shows how much damage Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign, is doing and has been doing to not only Kamala Harris, but to Donald Trump, and what it could continue to do should he stay in the race. According to NBC News, quote, "In that six-way ballot, Trump kept 87% of voters who backed him in a head-to-head contest, while 10% of his voters went to Kennedy." So again, it seems to be hurting Trump more than he's hurting Kamala Harris. So why now, though? Why drop out now? It's not like the prospects of Kennedy's victory have really changed in the last few months. It was always going to be a long shot. In part, their argument is that the Democrat Party has really done everything in its power, from lawsuits, using judges, to lawfare, to keep him off the ballot. So he really can't even get on the ballot.
I shouldn't be here right now. The DNC is in Chicago talking about their commitment to voting rights, and meanwhile, they're spending, tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to keep me off the ballot.
So again, the party that lectures about democracy and upholding democracy and voting rights for everyone worked really hard to keep that man off the Democrat primary ballot. So joining us now is the aforementioned Mark Groubert. As we said, he'll be in attendance tomorrow at the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcement in Phoenix. He's an LA-based investigative reporter. Mark, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for that, Eduardo. The situation, I'm going to try to answer all of those questions that were raised very quickly. Regarding the lawfare case against RFK Jr. in New York, he admitted foolishly that he, put that residence down as his legal residence, did not have a residence. He simply could have kept an apartment in New York. I don't know why he didn't do it. I myself did it for many, many years as an ex-New Yorker. He had no residence there. He lied ostensibly when he signed the document, the affidavit that his domicile was in New York. Regarding his other licenses and everything else, it was kind of meaningless. But that case has rolled into, by his own prediction, has now rolled into Pennsylvania, where he's going to be removed from the ballot. And that's why he's kind of pulling the plug. He sees the domino effect of him being removed from the ballot nationwide. Also, they're flat broke. He hasn't had an event since July. The money is dried up. Nobody's giving money to this campaign that never, ever had a path to victory. He has a lot of zealots around him. It's kind of like a cult. Shanahan kicked in some money from her Google daddy, and that got her the VP slot. But that money's long gone. It's a top-heavy campaign. It's been top-heavy since the beginning, with a lot of people taking a lot of top-heavy consultant fees. And now the time has come for him to SHIT or get off the pot. He can continue with no money, but there's really nowhere for him to go. He's polling about the same level. And according to Shanahan, for the first time admitting in a live interview that they were pulling votes more from Trump than from Kamala Harris.
Right. That's all true. But I guess from the broader point, we do have a system in this country that makes it impossible for an independent third-party candidate to run at a time when over 70% of Americans say they want a strong third party. This Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign seemed like maybe the one that we haven't really seen since the 90s to really make waves as a third-party candidate. What do you think, aside from all these things that you just mentioned in terms of his residency, I do agree he probably had a top-heavy campaign, but he did seem to resonate with voters in a real way. So what should he or what could he have done differently? Where do you think it went wrong?
Okay, the goal originally was to create a third party, and Shanahan's been talking about that for 2028. That's been their goal from day one, to create a third party, a populist-type party, and I think they may continue that. I have been saying for a number of months, and it's finally being admitted by Shanahan, that he should run for the California governor seat in 2026, which I think he's going to do. She said she supports him for the California governorship. Newsom is termed out. There's a bunch of minor people circling around trying to get their name recognized in California. He could run the fourth largest economy in the world with 40 million people. He can try out all of his ideas. In fact, she said she'd support him if he ran. This was the first admission, and I've been beating this California drum. And apparently they watch my show, America's Untold Stories, and Dr. Drew is very close to him. I went into great detail with Dr. Drew, who picked up the phone and talked to RFK about a month ago about this subject that I'm talking to you now. Shanahan says that if RFK does not want to do it, albeit if he gets a slot in the Trump presidential cabinet, then she would run for the California governor spot, because now she's got the taste of politics and how easy it is for her to run around and do these Twitter, spots. So either way, he's either going to accept a cabinet spot from the CDC, the FDA, or NIH if Trump agrees to do that. The idea of him running the CIA is preposterous. The woman who runs his campaign, Amaryllis Fox, is a former CIA agent. They can't be trusted. He could be trusted, but he's got baggage with him. The CIA is not the destination for RFK. Neither is the Attorney General spot. Same reason, can't be trusted by Trump. But I think CDC, FDA, NIH is a place where he could do a lot of good for a lot of people. He could do that for 2 years or a year and a half, and then run for the California governor spot. He's never held elective office. His father and his uncle were both senators. They both learned how to be senators. His father was attorney general, serving in a cabinet. He's done none of that. He's had no experience governing, ruling, running anything in his entire life. I suggest that running the state of California is a perfect match for RFK. I will be at this media event tomorrow morning down in Glendale, Arizona. I believe, because they're not releasing the address, that it's the same place where the Trump event will be held. As I said in that Twitter post there, I believe he will be in there earlier and then come back out on stage with Trump after the endorsement. It's just my guess. I have no inside information on that, other than the fact that they will not give me, nor the media, the actual address of the event. And this is now the afternoon of the morning, tomorrow morning. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, all fascinating points. And as someone reminded me yesterday, the idea of CIA or DOJ for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I mean, these positions require Senate confirmation, which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would never get, even from a Republican-controlled Senate. Right.
Right.
So how likely is it then that, say he's offered one of those other non-Senate confirmation required posts in the health areas you talked about, Do you think he does it? And then number two, as to the California governorship race, I mean, is that something he could realistically win? I know, obviously, Newsom.
He could walk in. He could walk in and take it. It's really? His for the walking in. Absolutely.
Could you explain some of the state politics there of how in such a blue state you could do that?
Right. It's a blue state, but when it comes to name recognition, I have two names for you: Arnold and Schwarzenegger. It's quite doable in the state of California. His politics actually line up perfectly with the state of California's liberal lefty loony bin thing. Shanahan has a lot of friends up in the Bay Area. There's money to be raised there. He's based in Malibu. His wife is a celebrity in terms of Cheryl Hines being a fairly famous actress. Everything lines up, and the fact that there is no opposition with any name recognition indicates to me that he could literally walk in and take the job.
As far as tomorrow goes in the event in Arizona where Trump is expected to come out, do you have any sources of on the ground as to what viewers can expect? What can people on the ground expect? Or do you think this is going to be sort of like a last minute thing and you'll know when maybe you literally see him come out on stage with Trump or something like that?
Well, like I said, them not providing the address of his press conference indicates that the press conference is going to be at the same address that Trump is doing his rally, which is this arena in Glendale. Otherwise, why not provide the address? The address is not being provided because you would immediately know it's the same address. Right. That's what it says to me. I mean, unless I'm crazy, I mean, why not give the address where the presser is going to happen? They're still holding it back. I've got media credentials approved for tomorrow with no place to go as of yet. So I believe at some point at 2 o'clock in the morning or midnight tonight, they will tell us that it's at that arena. If it's not, I'll go to a different place, but I'll also be attending the Trump rally afterwards.
And then real quick before we let you go, since you are in Arizona and you're going to be covering some of the politics there, how is that state right now? If you took a snapshot right now, I know we're some 70 days out from the election. There was a report a few days ago that actually Democrats could take complete control of the state legislature, which would really be, I mean, that would mark the end of red Arizona, whatever red people want to view that. I mean, it's not been MAGA country, but it has been Republican in some sense. That would totally mark an end to that. How likely is that? Is that being overstated, the Democrats' chances in Arizona? And what are Trump's chances in terms of winning that state back, which he would surely need to do if he wants any chance of winning the White House?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think Lake is not going to win. She's fairly well behind in these polls and it hasn't really budged. I'm watching the commercials on local TV here. They're about 5-1 for Kamala Harris in every market from Phoenix up to the northern portions of the state. I don't know where the Trump money is going. I don't know where it's being spent. It's not being spent here. That's for sure. So I look at Gallego. He'll probably a lot of ads, very few Kerry Lake ads. And I think that may be true. If it's, too close to call, I think that it's going to tilt blue Arizona in this election cycle, unless Trump could pull a rabbit out of his hat, which is why he's here today and tomorrow, I think.
Right. I just wonder what they're doing with that money and why they aren't spending it in Arizona.
I don't know.
Mark Groubert, thanks for coming on.
I have no idea. I said that the other day. Thank you. I mean, where is that money going? I wish this Laura Trump would come out and lay out the amount of money for ads. The ads that he's put out on the internet are high school level piece of crap ads. I mean, hers look like Hollywood movies. They're little mini films with a lot of money behind them. His look like they were slapped together by a high school kid in an audiovisual department. That's how bad they are.
Yeah, and also, okay, fine. If the money's being spent elsewhere, maybe there's a good reason for that. Maybe they could explain why and what their strategy is. But we don't even know if it's being spent at all to that degree. So it's just shocking. Mark,
no, and the reason we're suspicious is because in the past they've used the money for candidates down ballot that they want to give money to. They've sworn on a stack of Bibles they're not going to do it again, but it looks like they're doing it again.
Unbelievable. Mark, thanks so much.
Yeah.
More coverage out of the Democrat National Convention straight ahead. lot of low moments. There have been a lot of low moments actually all week at the Democrat National Convention, but especially last night, we thought this moment stood out. Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar won the night. Listen to the bilge he spewed from the podium.
When Donald Trump comes down to Texas, stands next to officers in uniforms just like mine, he's not there to help us. Don't think that, not for a second. He is a self-serving man. I mean, look, just like when he killed the border bill, he just made our jobs harder. Now, Kamala, on the other hand, has been fighting border crime for years. She's gone down to Mexico and worked to stop the traffickers. And when the traffickers didn't stop, she put them in jail. Now, down in my neck of the woods, we call that fooling around and finding out. I may be paraphrasing a bit. We protect them. Now, the border sheriffs that I know, right, and we're like Kamala. We protect and serve. We enforce the law. We show compassion. And we fight like hell to protect our border. Because as we've always known in Texas, cuando luchamos, ganamos. When we fight, we win.
Now that's obviously false. We could go list down the list and show you exactly how each of those things is false. But the one thing you need to know is when he says we protect the border, really is allowing 12 million people into this country in the last 4 years protecting the border. We should also just show you this, in which that same sheriff previously demanded Joe Biden and Kamala Harris fix the mess they made at the border. He once said they weren't doing their job. Take a look.
Sir, tell us about what you are asking for. What are your needs?
Well, right now, thank you for having me, first off. Right now, what I'm asking for is for the president or a member of his administration that can make decisions to come down and talk to not just me, but at least 12 other Texas sheriffs from major counties in the state of Texas that are dealing with this issue firsthand. So I'd like to see somebody from Washington come down here, get boots on the ground, get eyes on the issue at hand, and then talk to us, a bipartisan group of Texas sheriffs that are really taking a common sense approach because we have to.
So back then, Salazar felt the administration wasn't doing enough to protect the border, but when he's offered a cozy speaking slot at the Democrat National Convention, oh, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have just done a great job. It's interesting how his tune has changed. And that same bill that Salazar kept referencing, that bipartisan border bill, he doesn't admit that that bill was a poison pill. It would not have secured the border. It actually would have created avenues to allow up to 5,000 people a day before any enforcement measures were taken. Now, also on display last night at the Democrat National Convention were rising tensions between the pro-Palestinian radicals we've been telling you about all week and the organizers of the convention. Last night, the DNC platformed the parents of an American named Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who Hamas kidnapped back on October 7th. He is still in Hamas custody. You don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to feel concern for his story and to feel moved by the chance of bring them home that erupted last night as his mother spoke from the stage. Take a listen. So there's still many Americans being held and many hostages being held by Hamas. Yet following that speech, the DNC informed the leaders of the uncommitted movement. Those are the voters who say that they will vote uncommitted this fall if the Democrats don't do enough for Palestine. The DNC announced that a pro-Palestinian speaker would not appear on the main stage of the convention. That's what they told this uncommitted group. Again, the uncommitted voting group represents 700,000 pro-Palestinian voters in states like Minnesota and Michigan. These people could make or break the Democrat Party in November if they refuse to turn out. So it's obviously a precarious moment that the Democrats have to find a way to navigate, and they don't have a lot of time. But you can't feel sorry for them because they brought this on themselves. This is a party that has embraced the radical elements of not just this movement, but radical elements of many movements across the country, whether it's Antifa, Black Lives Matter. They are more than happy to use these groups and use these voters when it benefits them, and now they are paying the price for it. We turn now to Edward Szall, whose boots on the ground at the DNC. He joined us yesterday, and he joined us again today to tell us what the scene is there in Chicago as we head into the last night of the convention. Edward, thanks for coming on.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Eduardo. You know, it's funny because I think the only reason there wasn't mass violence at the DNC is because of the lack of work ethic among the Democrats. They just maybe were too lazy to burn anything down this time around. Not that they didn't wish to do it. Of course, you saw a lot of the craziness that has been on display, the fighting, the vitriolic hatred that I think a lot of people have been highlighting on the streets with burning of American flags and, of course, the screeds against Israeli citizens and the support of Israel here in Chicago. But honestly, maybe the biggest story out of the DNC has been actually how the RFK campaign has used the DNC to announce what they're saying is going to be the biggest announcement in the history of, he says, the country, but we know at least in the history of many independents in this country.
Yeah, I have a little different theory on why things have been so quiet in Chicago, and I think it's because once Joe Biden was removed from the ticket, the Democrat Party, the Democrat establishment wanted to make sure things went as seamless as possible for Kamala Harris. They knew the eyeballs would be on this convention. They knew the media would be covering it, and they wanted to make it seem like they were all united and things were swell. And in part of that, now to turn to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you know, there are obviously talks that his endorsement of Trump could tip the scales in a lot of ways. But I guess my concern, or when I look at an endorsement like that, it really comes down to how it plays in the swing states. I mean, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has his supporters across the country. I like the guy. I think he's been great for politics. But talk to us a little bit about his influence in states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona. Do you think he's enough to tip the scale in those states?
Well, I absolutely do, and I think that the polls are showing this too. We know that during the primary process, RFK has demonstrated approximately 10,000 voters in Georgia. And this is in a state that President Trump leads by only 2.7 points. So this could, again, tip the scale there. But most importantly, Arizona, I think, is the primary reason why the Trump campaign has considered this alliance. Because in Arizona, President Trump, according to latest reports from The Hill, is only 0.1 ahead of Harris there. And you think about this, that state is unique because about a third of the voters in that state are independents. There was actually a short period of time earlier this year where independent voters actually outnumbered both Republican and Democrats. This, again, is the state that brought us Kyrsten Sinema, who left the Democratic Party to become an independent. I think this is why RFK is making his announcement in Phoenix. But you think about this, too. There's so many overlaps because RFK hasn't been very vocal on immigration. That's not a topic for him, per se. Maybe he's even taken the Good Samaritan approach to the subject, maybe a Democrat Party kind of tone to it. But if he's joining the Trump campaign, he's going to have to adopt the language of the campaign. But pairing this, again, with the message of safety for children, it's a clear overlap between the two issues. And I believe President Trump is smart in considering this because this could secure him these battleground states.
Yeah, I just wonder how there are a lot of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. supporters who seem disillusioned with Trump a little bit. And Trump himself has really embraced, as an example, he's not going to have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. go out there and talk about vaccines. Trump has gone out there and bragged about the fact that he helped Operation Warp Speed come to fruition. He helped bring the COVID vaccine to the American people. So do you think they're going to resolve that disconnect? Do you think they're going to find a way to have him out there messaging on those issues? Or do you think he might be out there on something totally different, or maybe not out on the campaign trail at all? Like maybe it's just a deal to promise him a cabinet post, but they really have no intention of him being out there to voters. How do you think they're going to use him from here until November?
Well, first of all, I think this, the RFK campaign has made it contingent on the endorsement that he would get to speak about the vaccine safety platform. And I say this to say, if you're negotiating and brokering a pretty major deal with the opposing political party, someone you're running against for president, and the day before you make the announcement and sign the deal, you come out with a very big video about your platform specifically on how you feel the COVID-19 crisis was mishandled, how administration officials under President Trump's first term, such as Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, that they mishandled it and also didn't do proper steps to safeguard the American people. And this video that RFK put out today on Twitter, it was specifically targeted at the lack of safety, the lack of testing, and the danger of all vaccines. He did this before, again, an endorsement. And I think in respect to the campaign, I don't think it even has an impact if he's not out campaigning. I don't think about Ron DeSantis, for example, the governor of Florida. him endorsing President Trump after the Iowa and South Carolina caucus, you think about this concept. Did it really have a hit if he's not out campaigning for people? You know, he's not campaigning for President Trump. He's not telling people constantly, I support him. Right. If you vote, we're going to vote for me. You're going to vote for him. It's the same kind of candidate. It doesn't have an impact. So I think it would be worthless if RFK was not joining President Trump in the campaign. Maybe the way to think about this is it's a way for President Trump to actually address the grievances some of his voters and some who are willing to vote for him have over Operation Warp Speed. And these are fair grievances. There's been side effects. There's been all kinds of problems that have been experienced by individuals. And actually, I want to point out one of the people, one of the key players in bringing this deal to fruition was a Florida banker named Omid Malik. Now, he's been a big donor for RFK and also a big supporter of Tucker Carlson. Well, his transition from a Democrat to a Trump voter, a Republican, was actually specifically due to the lockdowns in 2020. That's what changed his mind. And he's reportedly the man who talked RFK into this decision.
Yeah, I think you make a great point about the fact that this could be a way for Trump to signal to his voters, maybe not a complete, I have completely changed my views on the vaccine and how I handle things, but almost like a concession of, okay, I can see why many of you disagreed with that, and you know, me bringing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into the fold is a promise that things would be different in the future. Edward, really quick before we go, if there were one or two other cabinet members you'd love to see in a Trump post that you think are realistic, who would they be, what would their positions be, and why?
Well, of course, it would be hilarious for him to serve as the CIA director. I just don't think that's in the cards. But I think what is a very reasonable position is the head of the FDA.
Right. No, I meant not Robert F. Kennedy Jr., just other people in general. Yeah.
Oh, other people in general. I mean, I think we're going to see Vivek Ramaswamy take a cabinet position. I just saw him today at the Trump Tower. He's hosting events. He's walking the streets of Chicago. I think any of the main people like Vivek that have put in the time campaigning on behalf of President Trump, they're expecting a position. I also don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that Nicole Shanahan could get a cabinet position, or at least a senior position of some sorts, if she wants it. Maybe in the field of tech. Maybe this is someone you could have serving the ESG fields in some form. Lastly, I think that when it comes to, I hope that's not a Democrat protester. I hope it's just a car. That's just the car going off. I think the last person is Tulsi Gabbard. That's someone I have my eye on, Edward. I think that she, like many of these crossovers, someone who is more purple, not really a member of the Democratic Party anymore, they can do a great job to bring in centrists and also maybe even bring in the next generation to President Trump. Because younger folks, people like you and I, you know, we're not as young as some of the people like Bo Loudon, but our voice counts now. We vote. We're starting families. We care about people like Tulsi Gabbard, Nicole Shanahan, and RFK because it's our country to inherit. And they're specifically speaking about ways to make our lives healthier, which I think we could all benefit from.
For sure. All great points. Edward Szall, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, bless you. Take care.
Homeownership is increasingly becoming out of reach in this country for Americans of all age groups. We also have a record number of homeless in this country, and our politicians don't seem interested in doing anything to solve these problems. But our next guest has some ideas, so we'll talk to him about those solutions next. Homeownership is inextricably tied to a thriving middle class and the American dream. A home lists your physical stake in society. It's an asset that can be passed down from one generation to the next. It's something your children, hopefully, will inherit and will cherish. A home is also a symbol of sovereignty, a place to call your own, to the degree that we even still have that in this country. The surging cost of home ownership is such a cause for alarm for Americans across the country. According to Zillow, the income needed to purchase a typical home has soared by 80% in the past 4 years, just since Joe Biden has taken office. In January 2020, home buyers needed to make $59,000 a year to afford a home. By January of this year, the required income jumped to about $106,000, almost doubled. What's driving this? Obviously inflation and Bidenomics, but it's not all. In the last 3 years, we've had 12 million people come into this country thanks to Joe Biden's immigration policy. In my hometown of Miami, Florida, for example, we've had at least 1.5 million to 2 million, if not more, come into the city in that time span. And we obviously haven't built enough housing to accommodate those people. The same is happening across the country as migrants flow into every single state. Every single state is now a border state. So when young Americans, especially those who complain about the rising cost of housing and the fact that they can't afford homes, when they complain, they oftentimes don't make that connection. They aren't able to make the connection between immigration and housing unaffordability. Another cause is that the supply of homes is being strangled by the overregulation of property rights, which has discouraged developers from creating new homes. For example, in California, regulations and the high cost of borrowing in Joe Biden's economy have made it harder for developers to turn a profit. So they're building fewer homes in a state where supply is already short. Remember, this is a state, California, that already has the largest homeless population in the country. People are fleeing California in U-Haul truck caravans because it's so unaffordable to live there. And again, it's not just California, it's all across the country. Both parties are to blame for this. It's not just Democrats who have failed to uphold this pillar of the American dream, home ownership. In his book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, James Burling argues that the problems we're facing today are a century in the making. Both parties bear the blame. Both parties are failing to put home ownership within reach for the present and future generations of Americans. So joining us now to discuss all this is James Burling. James, thanks for coming on.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
So obviously, as I said in my intro, the home ownership crisis we're facing has a lot of different factors and a lot of different causes, but it seems just in the last few years alone, it's become even more unattainable for most people in this country. So how do you see the problem and where do you see it going regardless of who wins this next election?
So the housing crisis that we are in today is really the result of failed policies after failed policy after failed government policy. And this has been going on for nearly a century. It has gotten particularly bad in the last several years because of a confluence of factors. But you look at the inability of American industry to build enough homes to meet the demand is the primary reason. And why is people not able to build homes? That's because of excessive rules and regulations across the country, whether it be zoning rules that make no sense anymore, environmental rules that take vast areas of land off of the table for building new homes, or whether it be lawsuit abuse, where anybody trying to build a few homes, especially in some of the coastal areas, gets hit by one lawsuit after another lawsuit after another lawsuit, which simply slows the process down so it is impossible to get a house built in a decent amount of time to turn a profit. And builders want to turn a profit, of course, to have new homes. So it's just a confluence of these factors. We've always had, for the last 40 years, an imbalance between supply and demand, but that imbalance is growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And recently, it's really reached a breaking point, which is why you've had this sudden acceleration of prices, far worse than anything we had before.
How big of a factor is the BlackRock, Wall Street element to this? I know it's become a popular talking point that these large private equity, these large investment firms, and these Wall Street banks are buying up homes by the thousands in certain communities and then selling them, in all cash offers, basically making it very hard for people who are from those communities or people who would otherwise like to move to those communities from being able to afford it. I mean, if you're going to be outbid by Wall Street, you don't have a chance. And so obviously that is happening, but how much of that is playing into the overall crisis?
Yeah, I think it's a result of the crisis rather than a significant cause. Yeah, there are some areas where BlackRock and others are buying a significant number of houses, but by and large, the numbers don't bear out that it's a significant factor in most areas of the country. What BlackRock or other investors are doing is putting capital into housing because there is such a shortage of housing out there that it is a safer bet than a lot of other places to invest capital. So if we had built enough houses, if our supply was meeting demand, then there wouldn't be this diversion of capital by BlackRock and others into the housing market. They would go into other sorts of industries as well. But with such a what economists call an inelasticity of demand, especially at the lower level, the entry-level houses, the houses for the working people of America. That is where we're seeing the most pressure, the most price increase compared to income. Where it used to be you spend a third of your income on housing, now many people, especially in the lower rungs of the economic ladder, are spending more than half. That's what BlackRock is doing. They're simply taking advantage of an existing situation. I really don't see them as being the cause.
I want to talk to you about one of the proposed solutions to this crisis that I personally disagree with, and then we can go from there into maybe some other solutions you talk about in your book. I hear now the answer to this, both from the right and the left, especially the free market, maybe more libertarian right, talk about the fact that we have to get rid of these zoning laws in suburban communities, the not in my backyard, the NIMBY types who want to prevent multifamily housing from popping up in their neighborhood. These people argue that the lack of multifamily housing units is driving up the cost for everybody else. But to me, the reason why I'm against that, and I think the counter argument to that, is people like living in suburbs. People want to live in their home. They don't want to destroy the suburbs and just overcrowd them with these, apartment complexes and these large units that are going to house thousands of new people. People like the suburbs for the way they are. Do you see, is that, number one, a viable solution? Do you think that solution has support? And if not, what are some of the other solutions you propose in your book?
So I discuss at great length in my book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, how we got to the zoning regimes that we have now in communities across the country. And one of the rationales for zoning is to exclude multifamily housing apartments and the like. And that has caused really an extreme shortage of areas where you can build new workforce housing. The starter homes of yesterday are no longer being built because, in large part, they're illegal to build. My first home was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 900-square-foot home in Tucson, Arizona, and it was very affordable for somebody in his 20s with a new job coming into the workforce. Homes like that don't exist anymore, and homes like that are virtually impossible to build. So when we talk about reforming housing, it's not necessarily putting giant apartment buildings in the suburbs, but it is allowing people in those suburbs to have somewhat more building to go on. For example, you could take a single family, you could take an area with 1 acre single family homes requirement. You could divide that into 1/4 acres or 1/8 of an acre, still have homes, there'll still be suburbs. You could allow single family homes to be converted into duplexes or triplexes, small apartment buildings scattered around. Things like that could be done and still maintain the character of the suburbs that we all love, but at the same time, cause a significant increase in available land for housing and cause people to be able to build starter homes again. So I think there has to be some reform of zoning at the local level, but not the kind of drastic reform that people are afraid of either giant apartment buildings going into the suburbs or government subsidized low-income housing going into the suburbs. Both of those have their own set of problems, and I don't think that's really where reform is going to happen.
Right, and people live in the suburbs precisely because they don't want to live in these crowded urban centers. So you have to at least try to maintain that if you don't want to destroy them. It sounds to me, though, really that, aside from all these things, and of course there is overregulation and there's some laws that can be changed, but at the core of this, something that a lot of people don't, at least in my view, seem to want to admit, is that perhaps we have too many people in this country. I always hear people make the argument, well, there's swaths of land in the Midwest and the West, just underdeveloped areas, but do these people ever consider perhaps we don't want to live in a country as dense as India or China with 1 billion people? What is the end goal if we continue this population growth? Does America not have the right to preserve some of its natural spaces, some of its nature, some of its natural... you can't... The reality is you can't build everywhere. And so obviously there's nothing we can do about the population we already have here. If you were going to advise the next incoming president, Democrat or Republican, because I'm sure your policy prescriptions are the same either way. What would you advise lawmakers on what they can do tomorrow that would have immediate impact within the next 2 to 3 years, not just the next 20?
So I would consider that there needs to be a balance. We need to have areas that are protected, some of the open spaces, natural landscapes. That's great. But at the same time, we have to recognize the human needs as well. So when you have some cities in the West, for example, that are constrained by federal lands on all sides, you really need to look at those lands bit by bit, parcel by parcel, and say, can we build here? Does it make sense to build here? And we have to sometimes answer, yes, we can open up new lands for new building. That's the way that we have kept our housing supply and demand in somewhat balance for the last century or so. It's a balance that we're now losing because so few areas are available for home building. So we have to allow some areas for building. I am not able to constrain the country's population. I'm not necessarily sure I want to do that. We have a huge amount of land still available if we allowed it for construction, not only in undeveloped areas, but also developed areas. We're talking about infill development, turning houses, single-family homes into duplexes or triplexes. We can do all kinds of things without letting ourselves be overcrowded. Some of it will be new development on new areas. Some of it would be existing development in existing areas. But there's a lot more we can do if only we get government out of the way of building. The bottom line is, if somebody owns property and that person wants to build homes on that property, and building homes is not going to cause a nuisance or a serious deleterious impact on neighbors, that person should be allowed to build. That's the way it used to be, and that's the way we got out of ourselves of housing crises in the past. My book, Nowhere to Live, talks about the New York City in the 1800s, which was in horrible constraints, terrible tenements, huge overcrowding. But over time, we managed to build our way out of that. People built homes in the suburbs in New Jersey and New York. They built better apartments than they had before. And we got out of that problem. And we can do so again if we allow people to build.
The book is called Nowhere to Live. James Burling, thanks so much for coming on. All right, that's about it for us tonight here on The Absolute Truth. We'll see you tomorrow.